here we go, the other great iconic cafe. This is the Café de Flore. And if you look up and you see all this kind of sculpture into the buildings, this was all done by Northern Italian immigrants. People like Yves Montand, Serge Reggiani, and Lino Ventura, who came with a wave of Northern Italians. And as we know, the Italians are wonderful at construction. And all of this work was done predominantly by them. Let's kind of move over a little bit and talk about the history of this cafe. Well, you know, to me, we think of the 1920s, the Lost Generation, Les Années Folles, Hemingway, that whole period. However, for me, the 50s, or the après-guerre period, is a far more lasting and important thing. I think back to that period in the 20s, I think of that kind of overblown Hollywood attempt to capture that period in The Sun Also Rises with Tyrone Power, Ava Gardner, Errol Flynn, and if you can believe it, the very young and very handsome Robert Evans as the Spanish matador. A lot of drinking on that set, I'm certain. But in the 50s, here, you would have Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre working side by side and discussing existentialism, and she was writing her book, The Mandarin, and later The Second Sex, and Albert Camus. And they were all really uber lefties. They were communists, except finally when Uncle Joe got to the point where he'd been responsible for the deaths of 20 million Russians, Camus decided maybe Uncle Joe wasn't the greatest guy in the world, although de Beauvoir and Camus and Sartre never really gave up that particular dose. At the same time, there was an influx of African-American musicians. Very early on, Miles Davis, who was courting Juliet Greco. In a very public fashion. Remembering this is at the end of the Second World War. This was an offense that was punishable by lynching in America, so all this hostility towards blacks and racism existed for a long period of time. And certainly he was counseled by Sartre not to go back to America because of what he would encounter. But he, from a professional standpoint, he needed to be around. It's like playing tennis with a player who's not of your caliber. He needs to be in that creative atmosphere where he could work. But other people that came were Leslie Young, the president, and to really understand that period in history, I recommend Bertrand Tavernier's great film, Round Midnight. It begins to tell, round midnight, round midnight. The great Dexter Gordon on the saxophone, and doing a kind of a cross-pollination of Bud Powell on the piano, and Lester Young on the saxophone. So those guys were here. We also had a large influence of African-American writers who were fleeing the persecution of blacks in America. People like Richard Wright, who also was a communist, married to a white Jewish woman. Chester Himes, if he hollers, let him go, Cotton comes to Harlem. And of course, James Baldwin, a black homosexual. Again, these were all crimes in America for black people. But they could come here and they knew that they were safe. They knew that whatever their personal lives were, whatever their politics were, it was not important. In Paris, you were just a human being. So we had them. We also had a group of, remember the House Un-American Activities Committee. Largely, everyone was being slandered as having been a communist. People like Jules Dassin, who later married Melina Mercouri, made Never on Sunday. Rafifi was his great film here, A Night in the City with Richard Widmark that he shot in England. Jack Berry, who made John Garfield's last film, He Ran All the Way. These guys were all here. Once again, they were free. They were blacklisted in America. They couldn't work, but they found freedom and here in Paris. So Paris has always had this ability to ingather people from cultures where they were being persecuted either politically, economically, racially, sexually, and Paris to this day remains a very, very open place where one can be as free and open and whatever works for you as long as you don't bother anyone.